Lord bless his land with precious dew from heaven above, and with deep waters that lie below, with the best that the sun brings forth, and the finest the moon can yield, with the choicest gifts from the ancient mountains, and fruitfulness from the everlasting hills, with the best gifts of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of him who dwelt in the burning bush, the God of Moses, of course. To me, this is such a picture of what Israel has achieved today through the years of great suffering, toil, sweat, and tears, and above all, through the favor of Almighty God, which continues to this day. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of All Nations Church to our event, A Time to Speak. I want to welcome especially our guests of honor this evening, the Ambassador of Israel, Karif, Ophir Karif, and his wife Morira as well. The Ambassador of Poland, Miss Anna Sochańska. The Deputy Ambassador of Lithuania, Mrs. Virginia Umbarsiane. The Ambassador of the Kingdom of Lesotho, Mr. Sekulumi Paul Tsovale, and his wife Bontle as well. Welcome. And of course, the main speaker of our event, Tomi Reichental. To all the members of the Jewish community and to the many pastors gathered here this evening, you are most welcome. We are delighted and honored to have every one of you join us tonight. We believe that this evening's event will move you and hopefully bring you to a place of greater understanding and appreciation of the Jewish people. I now welcome Pastor John Ahern. Thank you.
I have the privilege tonight of introducing Tomi and Reichental. Sorry, it's been a long week, but it's a great honor to welcome him here tonight. He's the writer of the book I Was a Boy in Belsen, and you know what? He's going to be telling his story tonight, so I'm not going to get into it. I just would like you to show your appreciation as he comes up to speak. Amen. Thank you, Tomi. Thank you, sir.
Good evening. You all very welcome, of course, all the excellencies to this special evening that we are commemorating the Kristallnacht, the night of the glass, which happened, of course, 9th of November 1938, and we are commemorating today the 81st year since then. During this pogrom that happened in Germany, over 280 synagogues were burned down. There were many dead, it's estimated well over 100 people, Jewish people, and also 30,000 Jews were arrested. In fact, the Kristallnacht is in some quarters of the remembrance the day the Holocaust really began. But I'm one of the consequences of this event, and therefore I'm not going to speak about the Kristallnacht, but I'm going to speak about my own experiences during the Holocaust. I'm one of the people that actually survived, and even though we always speak about the 6 million Jews that perished in the Holocaust, they are not very much talked about the people that survived. And we had a very, very tough time at the time, and I think it will be a story that you will realize when people are trying to deny that the Holocaust happened. I'm a witness, and I'm one of the people that was there. Holocaust did happen, and I'm going to speak about it. I also try to speak a little bit about the situation of today, what is happening in Europe and other places as regards the rise of racism, anti-Semitism, and we have to be very careful when we living among these people and when we seeing what these people are capable of, and we don't need to go, of course, too far. It's happened here, especially lately in Ireland with the demonstration and leaders of the community, splitting community and creating a situation for many people not very pleasant. We saw the couple that was on the Late Late Show, because it was a mixed couple, and they suffered such abuse and threats against the daughter that they had to leave Ireland and go to England for a while because of the abuse they got. So it's very difficult to absolutely even to think that it can happen in our society. And we have to remember, Holocaust did not start with gas chamber. Holocaust started with whisper, with the taunt and with abuse. The gas chamber were the last stroke, last moment of the tragedy of the Jewish people. So we have to be very aware that we have to stop the process at the stage of the whisper. And therefore, if you see anybody that is bullying somebody else because they different religion or different color skin, or because they foreigner, don't become a bystander. Get involved and tell them this is not the country that this type of thing should happen. And if it doesn't stop, inform the authority that these type of people are living among us. So this was only a little thing that I wanted to mention, because of course we are living in a very difficult time, especially because of the refugees. We have the problem of in Europe that many right-wing elements are getting into the government, and it just needs a spark, some nasty person, and Holocaust can repeat itself. So that's why today the subject of Holocaust is a very important subject, because we can even see the sign of history repeating itself. We must remember that in the late 1930s, the Jewish people wanted to escape Europe from the Nazism. They saw the cloud that they were coming, and nobody wanted them. Among them, of course, Ireland. They wouldn't receive any Jewish people. And in the end, the tragedy happened. Today, we have the refugees, who are people that are escaping also persecution, murder, rape, and they're just trying to find a sanctuary in Europe. These people are professional people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to escape, because it costs a lot of money for them to actually escape, and paying all these gangsters for getting them out. And they're trying to get to Europe, and Europe, again, doesn't want them. So I do speak about it because I feel very much what these people are going through. I went through the same thing. And Ireland can't really be very proud even today. We took just several hundred refugees, and I think Ireland should take more. We are a wealthy country. I know we have our problem. We have problem with housing and all kind of in the community, but we must not mix these two together. There is a problem for housing, and there is a problem to receive these refugees, integrate them into the society, give them job so that they become a productive member of the society in Ireland. I will sit down, and I will get now to the lecture as well and speak about my own experiences. I would start with the slogan, "Never Again." And it is a slogan that I'm using now lately. I never used to mention it. because when I was thinking about Never Again, I realized that, unfortunately, since the Second World War, of course, this slogan was in relation to the Holocaust, and we used to say, never again, this was after the Second World War. But can we say it today? If you just go to the history a little bit since the Second World War, we have the Cambodian genocide where 1.7 million people died. And it's not that these people were dying because there was a war or something. They were dying because they were a different clan or different religion or whatever, and one group against the other massacred many people, as I said, up to 1.7 million. We have Rwanda, of course, which happened in 1990. There was the dispute between the Tutsis and the Hutus, and the Hutus killed over 800,000 Tutsis. So that was a tragedy, that was a genocide. We had the Bosnian situation where we had a civil war and about 100,000 people died. But there were also a genocide. I will speak about that. You have Darfur, which happened in 2003. So can we say today, never again? It did happen again. And the one that I like to mention is, of course, Bosnia, because Bosnia is in Central Europe. It's a civilized society, and it didn't happen in 1945. It happened in 1995. I stood in the graveyard of Srebrenica, where 8,300 Muslims are buried, not because they had weapons in their hand. They were killed because they were Muslims. I stood there in the middle of that graveyard, and I prayed as a Jew in Hebrew for the Muslim people, the suffering and the horrific thing that happened in, as I mentioned, Central Europe in a civilized society. So, okay, I don't know, there was something wrong with the microphone. Anyway, I hope you can all hear me. As I mentioned, I'm going to speak about the Holocaust. And when we speak about the Holocaust, usually when I ask somebody, what you know about the Holocaust? They tell me, they shake their head and they tell me 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. Basically, that's the answer that you get. But I try to explain the Holocaust was not only about 6 million Jews that perished. And I have here a quote from another Holocaust survivor. His name was Thomas Burgenthal, and he expressed this exact point that I always wanted to sort of say, but I couldn't say it in the right word. And what he says, to speak of the Holocaust in terms of number 6 million, which is the way it is usually done, is intentionally to dehumanize the victims and trivialize the profoundly human tragedy that it was. So what was Holocaust? Holocaust was about racism, loss of freedom, loss of dignity, humiliation, loss of education, confiscation of property, enslavement, starvation, torture, mass execution, and of course, finally, the final solution to the Jewish question, which was decided in the Wannsee Conference on the 20th of January 1942. There were 15 high-ranking officials and officers, and the main instigator was Reinhard Hendrich, and there was also Adolf Eichmann, who was the man that deported the Jews to the extermination camp. And within 2 hours, while they were eating a 5-star dinner, they smoked the best cigar, they drank the best brandy, they found a solution to the Jews, simply eradicate Europe of the Jews, which numbered at the time 11 million, and they nearly succeeded. They killed 6 million Jews. But because I'm a Holocaust survivor, I like to speak about the survival. And my life started in Slovakia. I actually like to again introduce myself. I was born in Slovakia. I live in Ireland for the past 60 years. I'm Jewish and I'm a Holocaust survivor. And at the time, in the late 30s, the Holocaust started, of course, and the war started in 1939, and the Czech Republic was occupied, Sudetenland was annexed by the German, and they also imposed a puppet government in Slovakia. And we lived in a small village. It was a farming community. My father was a farmer. When I wanted to see the tree of the family, how they come to Slovakia, how long we lived in Slovakia, I was able to go to beginning of 1870 already. The Reichental family, my family, lived in Slovakia. So we lived in Slovakia for generations. We considered ourselves as Slovak and then Jews. But when this Holocaust began, which we tried to take it from about 1941, 1942, the German government imposed a puppet government in Slovakia, which was a very right-wing government, dictatorial government. It was led by a Roman Catholic priest, Joseph Tiso. He was a big anti-Semite. He didn't like the Jews. He surrounded himself with right-wing element. As I say, he was imposed on Slovakia. He was not elected into the government. But because it was a friendly government to Germany, to the Nazi regime, while the rest of Europe was being occupied, like Belgium, France, Holland, Slovakia, in fact, was not occupied till 1944. So anything that happened in Slovakia was done by the Slovak government. Once Joseph Tiso came to power, the propaganda against the Jewish people began. At the time, of course, we didn't have the information system that we have today. So in the rural area, very little people knew very little what is happening in the rest of the world. If you had a radio, you were considered as a middle-class person. And newspaper, we didn't get newspaper, but if anybody passed through the village and he went to the pub and had something to eat and drink, and he left the newspaper behind, we knew what is happening. So the propaganda was spread through the churches. At the masses, they blamed the Jews for everything that was going wrong in Slovakia. If the harvest wasn't good, they said it's the fault of the Jews. The Slovak rural people were good people. They were farmers, they were simple people. Roman Catholic, Slovakia was a Roman Catholic state, it's still today as well. The people listened to the priest, and slowly they began to believe what they were being told is true, and so the anti-Semitism began. It didn't take a long time before the Slovak government introduced the first racial law. It was called the Jewish Codex. It had 270 paragraphs restricting the life of the Jews. We had to wear a yellow star. We were not allowed to go to any public places like cinema, theater, swimming pool, public park. We were not allowed to go to national school. There were silly restrictions like we were not allowed to cycle or drive a car. Many properties were being arizated, in other words, were taken, and other people were put in charge of the businesses. Small businesses were being closed. So the life of the Jewish people in Slovakia became quite difficult. But Slovakia, as I mentioned, was very friendly with Germany. They even joined the Japanese-German Axis. That there was great cooperation, and it helped Slovakia economically. When the war broke out on the Polish border, they used to transport weapons and the heavy weapon tanks and guns and ammunition, manpower through Slovakia. The German paid for it, which helped the Slovak economy. Also, many Slovak young men and women went to work in Germany to help with the war effort. They sent home their wages, which again helped the Slovak economy. So it was a great cooperation. But once the Jewish Codex came out, the Jewish people began to suffer. And this is a page from a Slovak newspaper. It's People's Newspaper, dated Bratislava, 21st of September 1941, just after the Jewish Codex was introduced. And of course you can see the headline, "Last Toll for the Jews, the strictest racist law against the Jews are Slovak. In certain aspects, the Slovak anti-Jewish laws are stricter than the German ones." They're referring to the Nuremberg law. So you can imagine, in response, the people began to beat Jewish people on the street. They damaged Jewish property. You have here a caricature that shows a book, and the Jewish people are falling out, and a Jew is looking up, signifying that the legal law no longer covered the Jews. So if the property was damaged or they were beaten up, they couldn't even go to the police and complain, because we were no longer under the Slovak legal law, and we were practically expelled from the society. And as I mentioned, we lived in Slovakia for generations. We consider ourselves Slovak. My father was in the Slovak army. I had an uncle that was one of the first pilots in the Slovak Air Force, and suddenly we were strangers in our own land. I was at the time 6-year-old. I didn't know anything what is happening. For simple reason, my parents never told me. They didn't want to frighten me. What will a 6-year-old understand if they tell me that we are persecuted and all these things are happening? So I practically didn't know anything. Today, a 6-year-old not only know what is happening in Ireland, they know what is happening all over the world with the television, internet, and computer, and all these things that they have in their disposal. So, of course, I didn't know what is happening beyond the village. I didn't even wear the yellow star in the village, because everybody knew us anyway, and there was no police to enforce the laws. So when I was thrown out from the school as a 6-year-old at the time, I was sent to a town where there was larger Jewish population. They had Jewish school there. So I had to go to the Jewish school. And I remember when my aunt was sewing the yellow star on my coat, I innocently asked her, "What is that for?" Because I didn't know. I never wore it in the village. She said, "We are Jewish, we have to wear a yellow star." So I didn't complain. I said, "Well, if I have to wear it, I wear it. It's no problem for me." Didn't even ask why. And she went with me to the school, of course, because the Jewish population lived in certain part of the town. So the synagogue, the community hall, and the school was very near, and the school was about 300 yards from where we live, maybe 400, I don't know. But my aunt went with me a couple of times, and she said, "Well, you know where the school is, you can go on your own." And that was the first time that I realized I'm different. Because when I saw children on a corner of a street without a yellow star, they suddenly started to shout at me, "You dirty Jew, you smelly Jew, go to Palestine," and all kind of insult that I couldn't even mention. And as the time went on, they became more aggressive. So I had to run all the way to the school and run all the way back. When I saw some children on the side, I would run to the other side of the road so that they can't spit at me, and they used to throw stone after me. They caught me a couple of times, gave me a couple of kicks in my backside, and let me go. So the life became for me very, very frightening. But during this time already, the Slovak people themselves were beginning to hate the Tiso regime in Slovakia. He was a dictator. Anybody that didn't belong to his party was discriminated against. Anybody that spoke against the government was being arrested and sometimes never seen again. So the population began to hate the government, and the German asked to supply more volunteers at the time. It was in 1941, end of 1941, that they need more volunteers to help with the war effort, and not many Slovaks come forward. This was very embarrassing, of course, to Tiso, that he couldn't serve his master in Berlin, and therefore some of his extremists in the party, they come to Tiso and said, this is an opportunity to get rid of the Jews. Let's suggest to the German that we haven't got many volunteers from the population, from the Slovak population, but we can give them young Jewish men and women, and perhaps they will take the suggestion. And so there was a meeting in Berlin. Some of the important people attended this meeting, and they reached an agreement. The Germans were prepared to take the Jews, but they said that they have to be paid for every Jew that will be taken out of Slovakia. And the Slovak government agreed to pay 500 mark for every Jew that they will take out. I'm mentioning this because this was a unique agreement. No other country in Europe ever paid the German to take the Jews away. It was only Slovakia that paid the German. The German claimed that this is their resettlement money. In other words, till these people will learn some profession to do, The Germans will have to look after them, they will have to feed them, they would have to clothe them, and this 500 mark will cover the expense. There was also another paragraph that the German insisted, and it was that any Jew that was taken out of Slovakia had to be stripped of her or his Slovak citizenship. That was very important for the German, because it meant once the Jews crossed the border from Slovakia to Poland or to Germany, the Slovak government had no jurisdiction what will happen to these people. Of course, today we know what happened to them. The deportation started in March 1942. First it was single men and women, and later on everybody was being taken. The deportation went unabated from March till October. Within this 6-month period, 52 transport left Slovakia, each transport between 1,000 and 1,500 Jews. Altogether, 58,000 Jews were deported. According to the statistic today, after the war, out of these 58,000 Jews, only between 280 and 500 survived. The rest of them all perished in the Holocaust. During this time, 30 members of my family were taken away. They were my uncle, aunt, my grandparents from my father's side, cousin. I knew them all. The cousins, they used to come to the village. We used to pray with them for the annual holiday. After the war, we found out that they all perished in the Holocaust. It was a day, one day in 1942, that we said goodbye, and sometimes didn't even cry for them, and that was the last time we saw them. My grandparents from my father's side, they were taken in July 1942. Also, we said goodbye, and we said everything will be all right when it's all over. We will be reunited. We never saw them again. In October 1942, the deportation suddenly stopped. Again, I want to remind you that Slovakia was not occupied by Germany at the time. There was a Slovak government, the Slovak people were responsible for the deportation. Only a German signed the order for the deportation. This was also a legal part of this arrangement, so that the Slovak can say, we didn't do anything, we just handed the Jews to the German official, signed a document. Hans Ludin was his name. He was the ambassador representing Germany in Slovakia. His job was to sign this deportation order. So still till today, the Slovakians say it was a German that sent the Jews to the gas chamber. And of course, our teacher, they were taken away beginning of 1942. So my education ended about February 1942. I went home, and the next time that I went to school was in end of 1945-46. So I lost completely my basic education. I have to start in end of 1945, sitting with 6-7-year-old children in a school, learning how to read, how to write, how to do mathematics. I had tough time. I was being bullied, because you can imagine these kids, they didn't understand what happened to me. I never spoke about it. I, in fact, didn't speak about my experiences for 55 years, not because I didn't want to speak about it, I just couldn't speak about it. My wife passed away in 2003. She never knew what happened to me during the Holocaust. She only knew that I was a Holocaust survivor. I never told her what I went through. I just started to talk about the Holocaust about 2004, 2005. So I couldn't write or read or do mathematics, but in the end I went to college, eventually to a technical school. I acquired a diploma in engineering, and I didn't do badly in my adult life in the end. But we were at the time in the village, and even though the deportation stopped in October, which it was for two reasons, but there are many reasons why it stopped. One of the reasons was that the Jewish leadership bribed the officials that were responsible for the deportation, because, as I said, we were not occupied by Germany. And also the Vatican was pressing on Tiso because he was slowly the news were filtering what was happening in Auschwitz, that the Jews were being gassed. In fact, the Slovak Jewry were the first Jews that were gassed in Auschwitz. And he was telling Tiso, stop the deportation. Your citizens are being massacred in Auschwitz. And from the beginning, he wouldn't answer the letter, the pleas. He wouldn't receive a delegation. But in the end, between these two pressures from the people that were being bribed and Vatican, they stopped the deportation, but Jews were still being arrested in Slovakia. We didn't believe that this is over. We thought that the Slovaks just want to bring the Jews into a place in these camps in Slovakia, and perhaps in 6 months they will have them all in, because there were still between 25 to 30,000. In Slovakia, there were about 90,000 Jews. So in this first phase of deportation, 58,000 were deported, as I said. So there were still around 25, 30,000 Jews left in Slovakia, and they were being arrested and taken into these detention camps in Slovakia. But everybody was trying to avoid being arrested because we didn't believe in it. I remember many times when the police was on the way to our village, we would be informed, because many people supported us because they hated the Tiso regime. So we had a little bit of help from the population. So when they were in the neighboring village looking for Jews, they would say to us, go and hide somewhere because they're on the way to your village, they are looking for you. And we used to run to the cornfield, and we stayed there for the whole day till we heard that the police left, and we come out. We locked the house, so they must have told the superior that we were not home. So it was sort of a time of hide and seek, but it wasn't a game. It was a very frightening and serious problem. It's happened all the time, from time to time. But eventually, the Slovak people rebelled against the Tiso regime. They wanted to bring it down. There was a rebellion, uprising. It happened on the 16th of October. It happened in 29th of August 1944. Of course, many soldiers joined the rebellion, many police joined the rebellion. So Tiso had no power to suppress this uprising, and therefore the German army, for the first time in August 1944, occupied Slovakia, not because they wanted to occupy it, but because they wanted to save the friendly Tisza regime. But unfortunately, with the army, also a unit of Adolf Eichmann arrived to Slovakia. It was the Gestapo, which was the German secret police service, and we knew that it is only a matter of time and we will be betrayed because the Gestapo and the Slovak police joined forces, and they become very efficient. They put spies in villages and towns to spy on these remaining Jews that were still in Slovakia, and we didn't know who was our friend, who was our enemy, and therefore we decided to leave the village, to go to live in another village where people didn't know us, and we will pretend that we were Gentiles. I remember we had to have false paper because with name like Reichental we wouldn't get very far. It was a German name, so if we were not German they would have known that we were Jewish. And so it was the local priest, Ladislav Harangozo, that provided us with this paper. He was a good man. He did not preach in the churches hatred against the Jews. My parents socialized with him. They used to go every day to play cards, have a little social drink. And at one of these meetings, my mother mentioned that can he help us because we need false paper? And he said he will. And he did. He got us new paper with the name of Vida. Vida was a very Slovak name, typical Slovak name, just like you have Murphy or Connor, a typical Irish name. And so we were able to travel. We decided that my mother, my brother, and myself will go. My father stay in the village looking after the livestock and the farm and the field. And he not only gave us the paper, but he also taught my brother and myself a little bit about the Catholic religion, because he said when we go to a new place to live, there will be a national school. We will have to go to the school, and if we don't know anything about the Catholic religion, they will very quickly discover that we were not Catholic. So he taught us the prayers that the children pray beginning of the school day. He taught us about the Station of the Cross, about the Holy Day in the Catholic calendar, how to cross ourselves, how to make a grace, all these little things. At the time, if somebody would have known about this, he wouldn't have been put on trial. He would have been taken out of the church, put against the wall, and they would have shot him. It was such a crime. So I never forgot the priest. He really put his life on line. And I went to visit Slovakia for the first time after 40 years, because we emigrated from Slovakia. I went to Slovakia after 40 years. Father Harangozo died in 1967. I went to the graveyard where he was buried, and in my own way, I thanked him for what he did for us. He put his life online for us, and even though in the end it did not help us, we were arrested, but he did that, which was very heroic of him. Well, in the end, my father was betrayed. We left the village. We were in Bratislava, and suddenly we got a telephone call from the village that my father was arrested and taken away. My mother thought, that's it. We will never see my father again. I didn't know, we didn't know. As kids, we didn't know what the consequences were, but she thought we will not see him. But after several days, we received a postcard from my father. There were 4 words: "I'm alive, don't worry." That was the last time we heard from him. We didn't know where it came from and what happened to him. And so I can only say that a miracle happened, because after the war we were reunited. He survived. He, of course, didn't know what happened to us. And after the war, for the first time, in July 1945, we were reunited for the first time. But unfortunately, we were betrayed as well. And one day, it was on the 16th of October, my grandmother first was arrested. She was beaten up, and she had to give names from the family who is looking after her. She was 76-year-old at the time. 76 was a very old age, not like today. We still think that we are quite young. But she was beaten up, and she had to tell who is looking after her. It was her daughter and son, and also my mother was caught at the time. When they opened the cases, they found children's clothes, and my mother had to tell them where we were hiding. We were in a photographic shop. Next thing, these 2 Gestapo men, we knew right away, because they had the Gestapo uniform, long leather coat with swastika on their left arm, hat and polished boot. They came to the shop and they said to my brother, "You Jewish?" And my brother said, "No, I'm not Jewish. My name is Miklos Vida." He thought the name would save us. And he asked once or twice more. Of course, he knew who we were. They started to beat him up. But my brother was quite tall. He was at the time 13-year-old. The next thing they asked me, "You Jewish?" And I said, "No, I'm not. My name is Thomas Vida." Again, once or twice they asked me, and next thing they were beating me up. I was hurting, crying, shouting. My brother was always very protective of me. He jumped and he said, "Please don't beat my brother. We are Jewish." And we were taken to the shop. We saw that 13 of us from the family were arrested on that day. We were taken to the Gestapo headquarters. We stayed in the cellar overnight. The next day we were taken to the detention camp Seret in Slovakia. In Seret they did the selection. I don't know how many of you knew what selection was, but it was a most cruel way how they separated the family, the wife from the husband, the children from the mother, from the father. And it was on the 2nd of November that we were called to this selection in Seret detention camp. When our family came in front of this high-ranking officer, his name was Alois Brunner. Alois Brunner played a god. He decided who is going to live and who is going to die. He escaped after the war. He went to Syria. He was advisor to the government there. The Germans wanted to extradite him. They wanted to put him on trial for crime against humanity. But of course, because of the situation in the Middle East, the Syrian wouldn't give him up. And so Alois Brunner survived and died a natural death in January 2000. But the Mossad, the Israeli secret service, sent him a parcel, and he lost a couple of fingers and sight in one eye, but they didn't succeed to kill him. He died naturally. Alois Brunner stood in front of us, 13 of us. 7 went to the right, and 6 of us, which was my grandmother, aunt, one of my cousins, my mother, my brother and myself, to the left. What that meant, the people on the right were young men and women, they were able bodies for work, and the people on the left side, they were destined for the gas chamber. As it happened, at the time, of course, when this was happening, my aunt didn't even kiss her husband goodbye. There was no time. They just went, you go to the right and you go to the left. We waved to our uncle and aunt. My aunt waved to her husband, said, when it's all over, we will be reunited. But unfortunately, the seven went to Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Buchenwald was a slave labor camp. The inmate worked in a stone quarry in freezing cold. It was at the time, of course, November, December, January, 12 hours a day, working day, with very little food and disease. The life expectancy in Buchenwald was about 2 to 3 months. So unfortunately, one of my aunts died in Sachsenhausen, and 5 of my uncle died in Buchenwald. Only one person survived. It was my cousin. He was 15 years old. When we waved goodbye to them, it was the last time we saw them. We were put into cattle cart. I can only mention that at the time, when we were standing before we were loaded to these cattle cart, we were in clean clothes, we were still civilized people. The moment the door closed behind us in the cattle cart, we were no longer civilized people. We were like the animals that were being transported in these cattle cart. There was no privacy, there was very little food, very little water, there was no hygiene. The place, the stench was unbearable after a day. And I remember from the beginning, everybody was shy to do anything, because it was all, we were there all together, about 50 of us. But later on, we were just like animals. Nobody cared. The conditions were deteriorating. We were traveling like this for 7 days. On the 7 days, the door opened from the cattle cart, and we were herded out and shouted, "Heraus, heraus, schnell, schnell." There were SS soldiers with Alsatian dog, with weapons. They were pushing us out, put us in rows, and we went on a march that lasted about 2.5 hours. Not on the road, but through a forest, for the obvious reason they didn't want to show the population what they're doing to the Jews. End of the 2.5 hours, we saw this chimney and glow was coming out. At the time, the adults among us knew about the gas chamber, they knew about the crematoriums, so you can imagine what my mother was thinking at the time. I only remember that she squeezed my mother, my brother and myself to her body, because what must have gone through her head was that that's where we are going. It is only perhaps minutes, hours that we won't be walking on this earth. So the adults among us, they must have been in a terrible state, but thankfully we were taken through this large gate. They were all building all huts around us and watchtowers. It was middle of the night. Nobody was outside. We were brought to one of these huts and told to go to sleep. We went in our clothes. We were absolutely soaked because it was raining that night. And it felt like a couple of minutes. Next thing, heraus, heraus, schnell, schnell, aufzähl ab hier. Quickly, quickly out to a roll call. And at the roll calls, we were told we were in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. At the time, we didn't know what Bergen-Belsen was. But this time, we found out that Bergen-Belsen was built in 1939 to hold first prisoners of war from France and Belgium, later on from Poland and Russia. These prisoners had to build the camp from scratch. It is estimated that 20,000 A Russian and Polish soldier died building Bergen-Belsen because, of course, they started, it was in winter, in middle of the forest, they had no roof over their head. The temperature in northern Germany drops to minus 15, 20 degrees. So many of them froze to death and from starvation and from disease. But in 1943, the German authority decided to convert the camp to hold inmates, mainly Jewish, but there were also gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses. They were German political prisoners. They were not treated any better than the Jewish prisoners. They were gays and they were lesbian. The camp was divided in about 6 parts. The day we woke up, when we were there, what we saw outside, the only way to describe it was hell on earth. We saw these people walking around. You can't even call them people. They were just bodies, skin and bone, with a shaved head in a striped uniform. And we didn't even know if they were women or men because they were just skeleton. You couldn't see any attribute if they were women. So only after several days we discovered that we were in the women's camp where the hospital was. The hospital was there not for curing people. The hospital was there to take the very sick inside, and they basically died in this hospital. There was no medication or anything. And we saw these sick, mortally sick women walking around, and they were walking aimlessly, very, very slowly. Occasionally they fell down, and as children we used to play, and when it's happened, we stopped playing and we were watching what will happen next. If she got up, we realized very quickly that if she got up, she had another day to live. But most of them never got up. And this happened every day, several times. So we actually saw people dying in front of our eyes. The life in Bergen-Belsen was very cruel. The life in Bergen-Belsen was just to survive a day. If you survive a day, you achieved something. And next day. The day started with roll call. In freezing cold, we had to stand for an hour outside till our supervisor came. They counted us. It used to take again about half an hour. So in freezing cold, minus 15, 20 degrees, we were standing there. We had not much clothes because we only have what we brought with us. We didn't wear the striped uniform. And after the roll call, we had our breakfast, which consisted of 2 slices of bread and black coffee. Lunch, we had turnips, which were cut in square and boiled in water, and in the evening, again, 2 slices of bread and coffee. That was our menu every day, no difference. The amount of food that this contained, if we translate it in today's terms, in calories, normal person, adult person, eat about 2,500 calories. People that do sport or something, heavy work, they eat even 3,500 calories. Our intake of calorie was a little bit over 600 calories. You can't sustain life with 600 calories. And therefore, when you come to concentration camp, and not only to Bergen-Belsen, any other concentration camp, what happened? That's what happened when you see archive film, you see all these skeletons walking around. Why? Because when you come there, you become, after a couple of days, you become very hungry. Eventually, you starving. The body begins to eat itself from inside. You're getting skinnier and skinnier. Then you become like a skeleton, and finally you die. And that's the process. And it takes weeks and months. It's not overnight. So it's a very painful death. People, sometime in the night, would run towards the perimeter, begin to climb it. Of course, the guard on the watchtower would see them. They would shoot them. We used to hear these shots being fired during the night, and in the morning we would see corpses lying on the barbed wire. And every day, 2 or 3, 4 of them, and this used to happen all around the camp. These people were so desperate. The pain of dying was so bad. They didn't try to escape. You couldn't escape. They just wanted to end it. Basically, they committed suicide. But the life in Bergen-Belsen was very tough, very cruel. People were beaten. People were starving, dying. Most of the death occurred due to typhoid. If you got typhoid, you got diarrhea, you got dehydrated, eventually you had no time, you had no strength to collect food, and you died. Once you got typhoid, it was sentenced to death. Again, it didn't happen overnight. It happened over weeks and sometimes even months. But that was the end. There was tuberculosis, there was diphtheria, people were dying from cold and starvation, of course. Every day, maybe 80, 90 corpses would be taken to the mortuary. It was the Sonderkommando, the special commando, and they would bring them to the in the evening to the crematoria and burn. And this was for obvious reason there, because the Germans from the beginning, of course, thought they will win the war, and after the war they could say, in Bergen-Belsen nobody died, there are no graves or graveyard, because the corpses were being burned and the ashes thrown around. That crematoria went day and night from the day we arrived till several days before our liberation. During the night you could see the glow coming out from the chimney. During the day the smoke, it was spreading over the camp, so there was all the time this stench of burning flesh. But we got used to that over time. We as children used to play. We had sort of a green area there, chasing each other just to pass the time. The life was very cruel, and we were starving all the time, hungry. You got your food, you were hungry, waiting to the next meal. So you're all the time thinking about the food. But already at the time, the German army were losing the war, and it was only a matter of time before we could be liberated. All the inmates, the prisoner, also prisoner from Auschwitz, were taken out by the German as they were retreating. In Auschwitz there were around, at any time, over 150,000 inmates. They worked as slave labor around in factories like Krupp, Farben, factory that did the paints and things. They still exist today. Siemens as well, and they worked as slave labor there. But of course, Auschwitz was also extermination camp where over 1 million people lost their life. Many of these inmates come to Bergen-Belsen. It's estimated that around 35,000 come to Bergen-Belsen. There was no room for these people. There was no food for these people. So they reduced even the food that we were getting, and the huts that were built for around 200 people suddenly contain 600, 700 people. In this congestion in these huts, epidemics of typhus broke out and people began to die in the hundred. It is estimated that in February, March, April, per day, over 500 people were dying, 17,000 per month. Of course, the crematoria could not cope with this amount of corpses, and therefore the corpses were just thrown out and in the open, and these piles were growing and growing and growing. By the time we were liberated, it is estimated that over 20,000 corpses were lying around us. You can imagine these corpses were decomposing and rotting away. The stench was unbearable. We lived in the middle of it. When the British Army was about 2 kilometers outside of the camp, they said the stench was unbearable. We were in the middle of it, but again, we got used to that. And in the green area where we played, suddenly there were a pile of corpses. And we continued to play. Where could we play? We played among these poor corpses. We played hide and seek. We didn't hide behind trees or walls. We hid behind piles of corpses that were rotting and decomposing. Can you imagine the sight as children we saw in front of us? Yet we got even used to that. And that's how the life went on. The cruelty continued, the beating continued, people were dying. But at the time we knew that liberation is soon, but it still took 4 months from, it was on the 15th of April. But before, it was on the 7th of March 1945, when I saw my mother and aunt crying. And I asked, why are you crying? What happened? And they told me that my grandmother passed away. She just dried up. She didn't have enough water, and she just gave up. And that morning, these two Sonderkommando came to the room. They stripped my grandmother. They picked up one by hand, one by leg. They threw her into the cart. Then she was wheeled up and thrown on the pile outside. My grandmother, the lady that read to me stories, baked beautiful cakes that I loved so much, and suddenly I saw how she was handled, and of course it's a memory that I will take with me to the grave as well. I will never forget that. But as I said, we knew that the liberation is near, and it was on the 15th of April 1945 that we heard this rumbling going through the camp, and we ran to the barbed wire to see it. It was in the middle of the camp, separating the men camp from the women camp. There were jeeps and lorries, tanks coming through, and they shouted through loud terror, "This is the British Army. You are being liberated." We didn't know even what liberated meant, but we knew that we were free. So we were liberated on 15th of April, and thank God the torture and the thing that we were going through finally ended. But unfortunately, not for everybody. There's still about 12,000 inmates died after the liberation because they were just too far gone, and they couldn't save them. I just want to mention a couple of statistics. First of all, Joseph Tiso was put on trial in 1947. He was sentenced to death for crime against humanity, and he was hanged. And not necessarily what he did to the Jews, but what he did to his own people. Also, out of the population of Slovakia, Jewish population of Slovakia, which was about 85, 90,000, only between 17 to 20,000 survived. The rest of them all perished in the Holocaust, among them 35 members of my family. Also the commander of Bergen-Belsen, Joseph Kramer, he earned the name the Beast of Belsen. He was put on trial with 12 others. After the war, it was the first trial of perpetrators, and 12 were sentenced to death, 19 to different length of prison. There were 49 of them, and the remainder were acquitted. But later on, they arrested about 200 more guards of Bergen-Belsen. Many of them had blood on their hand. They claimed they only were carrying out order, never stood a trial, and they got away with it. I want to read testimony. This was a medical team that was being prepared to enter the camp, and this is the commanding officer is telling them what to expect. The next morning, 17th of April, on a parade, our commander officer addressed us. He had visited the horror camp. At the time, Bergen-Belsen was called the horror camp, and corroborated the rumor. It is unbelievable, he said. There is no organization, no food, nothing. Half-starved, emaciated, spiritless, demented. These people are roaming the camp, have been reduced to animal level. I went through the women's quarter of the camp hospital, only about 200 yards from where we lived. Many of them are stark naked and are literally crawling about on their hands and knees, too weak to walk. They bedridden, just skin and bone, lying there on dung. In one small room were 40 women, few with any clothes, huddled together to keep warm. Some of these women were dead for days. Nobody had come to dispose of their bodies. I have seen some sight. I thought I could take anything, but this shook me, made me vomit. Outside, the dead are piled 4 feet high over a large area, and bulldozers are having to be employed to shovel these bodies into large pits. I could tell you more, even worse, but it's too sickening to talk about. That was Bergen-Belsen. I can only testify that I saw an English soldier, young men in their 20s, crying when they saw what they saw in Bergen-Belsen. It was the most humiliating place in the Holocaust. Thank God I survived it. I have here also a letter from Reverend Morrison. He was Irish. He was in the chaplain in the British Army, and he sent this letter to his sister Nora Birmingham in Ballysimon, County Limerick. I met the family. I thanked them for their uncle, that he was the first one, gave some humanity to my grandmother. He was praying over the graveyard there, over the large pits where these bodies were shoveled in. Maybe one of them was my grandmother, and he prayed over them, and I thanked the family myself. So I only read 4 lines. So far I have buried over 15,000, and I have not been able to attend all funeral, as I consider the dying more important than the dead. Those 15,000 did not take up much of my time, as 10 graves held up to 5,000 bodies each. 15,000 to bury didn't take much of his time. I want to show you also a couple of pictures, just a couple of them, because I'm not showing the horrific picture, they're very distressing. But this picture, it was in a film, because when the British Army entered the camp, in the first jeep, there was a film crew, and as the jeeps were moving, they were filming. And this boy here, that's my brother. So this is actually the moment of our liberation. So we have a memento from the liberation. I'm here somewhere as well, but I can't recognize myself. I also want to show you a picture how dehumanized we were. And this is a picture, you can see here 5 women, they are cooking, they're going to eat. Belgium, as I mentioned, was middle of a forest, so you can see the forest. And what you're seeing here, these are all corpses. Some of them are dressed, some of them are naked. These corpses are rotting and decomposing. And these women are going to eat. They don't even notice it. These bodies are probably all around them, here in the front as well. But it is about 6 feet behind them. And they're going to eat, they are smiling, they don't even notice it. That's how dehumanized we were. I just want to finish with a poem which is very appropriate to this lecture and is appropriate to this time that we're living in today. The horror of Holocaust is not that it deviated from the human norms. The horror is that it didn't. What happened might happen again to others, not necessarily Jews, perpetrated by others, not necessarily German. We are all possible victims, possible perpetrator, possible bystander. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Thank you. I don't think we have time for
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.